dormant, left to Georgia Foreman, swinging through the big city night. Big time, let's do it upright. Keep on dancing, groove through the night.
How could something so bad be so horrible? This was the opening line of Gene Morgan's review of the new horror film entitled Bone Dust. He typed away on his WordPerfect word processor from his desk, which was tucked away towards the back of this sprawling newspaper office. There were roughly 3,000 people working at the Tribune at this time, and Gene Morgan was one of the few whose name was recognizable to someone on the street. He had a slightly eccentric clothing style. His glasses were round and thick, making him easily distinguishable in a crowd. The button-down or polo paired with slacks was common, but the bow tie really solidified the whole ensemble. Someone bought him a bow tie for his first birthday at the office, and then it became a running gag. No matter what the bow tie looked like, Gene would wear it. It was just an extra quirk in his rich Rolodex of eccentricities. His scathing reviews of horror movies had given him a sort of cult status. Nobody could shred a bad movie with such wit and elegance as Gene. It became his calling card. His reviews were so good, it actually made people want to see how bad the movie was. It was counterproductive to making sure people didn't see the movie, but he loved his job. How could he not? He got to see movies for free, and now he was becoming famous. Kinda. If you loved movies, you loved Gene Morgan. If you didn't love movies, you didn't know who he was. And if you made movies, you might love him or hate him. But if you made horror movies, chances are you really hated Gene Morgan. As if he wasn't gregarious enough, he had a ton of change in his desk at all times. He never cooked at home. Legend has it that he had no actual food at his house. All of his meals were on the go while out in the wild. And because of this, he was constantly getting change back after making purchases. This came in handy when people would walk up to the vending machines, realize they didn't have exact change, then turn to Gene for a little extra coin, pun intended. This gave Gene ample opportunity to flirt with the ladies of this big sprawling office, and if a cute one caught Gene's eye and she asked him for some change, he would smile and say, "It'll cost ya." For a guy that could charitably be described as a bit round, he did quite well with the ladies. He was beyond harmless. If Harmless saw Gene in an alley, Gene would run away. Perhaps there was a link between his harmless nature and his aversion to horror movies. In fact, the only time Gene could be deemed scary was when he would tear apart a bad movie. It was just a matter of time until someone wanted to prove Gene wrong. Someone's got a secret admirer. Gene looked up from his word processor at the envelope being dropped onto his desk by Jamie, the wisecracking mail clerk whose tie was never on straight. "One of these days, Jamie, two things are going to happen." "Tell me, Gene." "One, you are going to fix that tie." "And two?" "Two, I'm going to marry Terry Hatcher. Which will come first, only time will tell." Jamie laughed as he walked away, delivering mail, while Gene opened up this envelope that had a return address in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Inside was a Polaroid picture of Red Line Video. It was taken during the day from across the street. Even with sunlight, this place looked odd. Gene turned the invitation over. There was tiny writing on the back that said, "Do you want to see the future of fear?" Gene was used to creeps and crawlers. He was the kind of guy you'd love to get an anonymous rise out of. Fans would send him letters, gifts, insults, sometimes all three in one package. By no means was he surprised when the film geeks of the world chose him to be their beacon to a social life. But there was something about this package that just felt odd. The store, for one thing, was very small. It was about the size of a slender barber shop, except it didn't have anything on either side of it. It looked like a Tetris piece that dropped down, but then no other pieces came after it. Gene put his magnifying glass over it. He could see an actual person in the store. Towards the back, their face looked almost scratched out. Same went for the titles of the movies. Had this photo been doctored? If so, it was very professional. The graphic design was more advanced than anything he'd seen at his paper, and his paper was one of the big ones. Luckily, this place was easy enough to find. There was only one Red Line Video in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Gene was creeping towards 50, and it had been a minute since he had had a real adventure. His job had always been his life. Finding a passion outside of his work was a lost cause. When he did travel, which was about once per year, he tended to see life through the film lens. He loved nothing more than to educate someone he had just met on classic films that shaped the golden age of cinema. For Gene Morgan, anything released after 1976 was dribble. There was a surplus of other critics who owed their whole livelihood to Gene. They took his style and ran with it. Without him to mimic, they never would have gotten their own outlets and subscribers. On top of everything else, there had never been a better time to be working at this Chicago newspaper. The Bulls were on the verge of their second three-peat, and nobody knew if Michael Jordan and company would come back or be catastrophically disbanded. The sports world, and to some extent the world, had never been more interested in Chicago. Gene knew this, and it was one of many reasons he felt like now was the time to strike while the iron was hot. Seize the moment. Step number one for Gene, if he was going to take the bait of this ominous invitation, tell his editor Jim Robards. Jim would find any reason to bust Gene's chops. He loved it. And Gene loved having his chops busted by Jim. So this proposal was a gift from the ball-busting heavens. They spoke alone in Jim's office, as Jim started with a quick jab after being told of Gene's desire to go to a video store in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So you finally cracked up, huh? Listen, we all knew this day would come. The last time you followed through on fan mail, you got the clap. And it was worth every doctor's visit. If you want this booty on the paper's dime, you're out of your mind. Between you, me, and the dead fish in that bowl, we're about 6 months from having to make some cuts. We got a little too aggressive with hiring last year, so we need to scale back a trim. So as much as I'd like to help you get laid, I can't. How about I buy you a pint at the Green Mill instead? Jimmy, think about it. It's a nice story. Major movie critic goes to watch the movie of a nobody in New Mexico. It shows I'm a man of the people. Man of the people, my ass. Jim Robards took another look at this mysterious piece of mail, confused. Who's a director? Jim asked. It's a store, Gene told him, excited. A rental store, specializing in horror. They spelled video wrong. V-I-I-D-E-O. It's a nice touch, Jim. Admit it. You're intrigued. I'm intrigued that you got duped. I don't see a half-naked blonde on here. What's the pull? The pull is a mystery, wrapped in a riddle. Gene began rubbing his hands together, trying to entice Jim Robards, which was not an easy task to pull off. Jim had been the editor-in-chief for 21 years. His glasses dangled around his neck while he lit a new cigarette. His formerly white walls now had a permanent gray tint from the 30 cigarettes being smoked within the walls on a daily basis. I'll take it out of my own pocket. Your own pocket? Call the psych ward. Gene Morgan is grabbing the check. Come on, don't bust my chops. What's the pull here? I haven't seen a good horror movie in 18 years. Oh, there's been some good ones. Name one. Shining. Nicholson. That was exemplary. 16 years ago, Jim. Jim leaned forward, ashing his cigarette, and told Gene, All right. You want my blessing to go to New Mexico and get a sequel to The Clap? Be my guest. I'll call you from the hospital. That was that. Gene Morgan was on his way to Santa Fe, New Mexico, completely blind, just the way he liked it. Make it a double. One for me, one for you. This was a standard line from Gene Morgan when ordering a drink, whether it was at a bar, a country club, a hotel, or in this moment, an airplane. Chicago was freezing during the spooky season of Halloween, so this made the prospect of a spontaneous flight to Santa Fe that much more scintillating. He felt 20 degrees warmer as soon as that gin and tonic hit his lips. The flight to Santa Fe was 3.5 hours. Gene loved to fly. Some people can't fall asleep on planes. Gene could conk out as soon as he took off his slippers, much to the chagrin of the poor soul next to him who might have to smell his socks being rubbed together. And the snoring. Gene had a legendary snore. His coworkers said you could hear it through the walls. You're confusing my stertor for the ecstasy of a young lady. Stertor was the brainy term for snoring. Gene had a loquacious spirit when it came to showing off words and phrases the common man had never heard of before. This was one of the top 5 reasons he had become such a prolific writer. He even tried his hand at writing his own movie script, which got produced and panned heavily. The irony of one of the most popular movie critics in the country writing a movie script that everyone seemed to agree was awful was not lost on anyone. Gene blamed the direction, the director blamed the script, whoever was at fault, the movie tanked. It was called Injection. It revolved around a burlesque dancer who donates a kidney to a man on death row, and then they end up falling in love. It came out in 3 theaters. Luckily, this was in 1981, and Gene had been in the public eye for long enough afterwards that his subsequent accolades and success had buried his one colossal failure. The hotel was a brisk 45 minutes from the airport, just enough time to make himself 2 more cocktails while taking in the semi-scenic views that Santa Fe had to offer. Gene made small talk with the driver. This was another Gene Morgan specialty, small talk with locals. Sometimes Gene would make up odd professions when asked what he did for a living. Today he was an anthropologist, sent here for a big dig. He burped between big and dig, and it sounded like big dick. The driver stayed pretty quiet after that. According to his map, Redline Video was 14 minutes from the hotel. His front desk clerk was a blonde who smiled at Gene, which meant she had met the requirements for Gene to fall head over heels in love with her. The origin of the phrase dates back to the 14th century in English, where it was originally heels over head. This version makes more literal sense because it describes the act of falling or flipping upside down. Eventually, it transformed into head over heels because it sounded more poetic. One of Gene's many random bits of vocabulary knowledge. The front desk blonde was named Justine, and Gene had no choice but to aim for a spicy introductory conversation. "Madam, I'm only here for 2 nights, therefore I am at your mercy. What shall I do?" "Only 2 nights? May I ask what brought you to Santa Fe?" "I'm scouting for a movie." Justine was beaming. She could have lit up Times Square on New Year's. "What kind of movie?" "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but it's a horror movie, and Sean Penn is very interested." "I love Sean Penn." "What's not to love?" Gene responded, reeling in Justine further. "Well, you're in luck, Mr. Morgan. Santa Fe has a lot of historically spooky places to visit." "You don't say," Gene said, while half of his body laid over the counter, his bloodshot, doting eyes struggling to stay open from the 4 cocktails and counting of his day-long excursion. Justine began to list the spooky spots to check out. La Posada, Loreto Chapel, La Fonda en la Plaza, Santa Fe Playhouse. Gene wasn't paying attention to anything Justine was saying. All of his mental acuity was being used on what she was wearing. It was nearly 5 o'clock, and if Gene was going to make a night of it, he needed a little food to balance the booze. Having politely declined his invitation to join him, Gene went alone to get steak at the Bull Ring at the suggestion of Janine, who was quietly doing jumping jacks that another drunkenly awkward flirt session was over, for now. She dreaded the prospect of seeing Gene again. Gene made small talk with the waitstaff. He was now an anthropologist scouting for a horror movie. Combining fake professions? This was a new duplicitous venture for Gene. He was getting a kick out of it. He was getting a kick out of everything. It was now 8 o'clock. Luckily, he had another 2 hours until the meeting started. All of the brief, very ominous correspondence with the mysterious filmmaker filtered through Gene's assistant. Redline Video opened at 10. "That's a good hook," Gene said. "Unsustainable, but a good hook. Stoned teens showing up at 10 to rent a spooky movie. The problem is you can't afford to stay afloat on just stoned teens. Eventually you gotta branch out. That's why slasher movies went extinct, and eventually we got Scream." That's what Gene told his assistant after she told him the odd operating hours of Redline Video. She also told him that the owner of this establishment would be offering a, quote, completely original and unique viewing experience, unlike anything you have ever seen before, perfectly tailored to maximize your personal viewing of a horror movie, end quote. His assistant, Sonia, 23, fresh out of the University of Chicago and eager to learn the ropes of film criticism. She beat out a couple hundred other applicants, mostly male, for the coveted role of Gene Morgan's assistant. It was almost unheard of for a film critic to have an assistant. Even Gene scoffed at the idea, but the paper insisted, telling Gene they wanted to encourage his public appearances and he needed someone to make sure all his appointments were kept. It took about 3 minutes for Gene to fall in love with Sonia's organizational skills. She was nearly 30 years his junior, yet knew how to keep him in line. Jim Robards warned him repeatedly to behave himself. They didn't have lawsuit cash laying around for a rainy day. Gene swore to be on his best behavior and more than once referred to Sonia as the daughter he never had or knew that he wanted. They became almost inseparable during work hours. Back in Santa Fe, it was now time to make the move. His waiter told him that the address on that invitation was actually not that far away. He could walk, but wouldn't recommend it. Gene had to ask why. It's spooky. I know that's a thing around here, spooky spots, but that whole section of town gives me the creeps. Tell me more, kid, please. What's the name of that store? Redline Video. Have you been there? Never heard of it. You should definitely take a car, Mr. Morgan. Don't walk around there, definitely not alone. Gene's intrigue was now exploding. Everything about his experience in Santa Fe so far had been building up to this moment. As if everyone was in on it. This is what he wanted. This is what he'd been missing from the cinema lately, that sense of wonder. When you walked in blind and left feeling like you could now see. Was he just getting older? Or had movies officially crapped the bed? Would this change any of that? Who cares? He was here and he was feeling alive. I'll walk. Gene paid his tab with a generous tip and walked the 2.37 miles to Redline Video. I could get used to this. That's what Gene thought as he walked from the restaurant to Redline Video. Gene used to walk a lot around Chicago. He loved it, his favorite form of transportation hands down. As his popularity grew, he would welcome the occasional chat with a fan. Whether or not they agreed with Gene's review, the conversation was always cordial. They would ask him to sign their newspaper, and he would walk away with another die-hard fan yelling, "Go Cubs!" But when his star shot too high, it became too much having to stop every other block to chit-chat with someone who just desperately wanted to talk movies. So he began taking more and more cabs, which was not great for his body either. He'd put on a little weight over the years. He swore to everyone that he would change course on his health before it became an issue. Maybe it was the 6 cocktails. Maybe it was the lack of people. Maybe it was being able to walk freely. Maybe it was just the right amount of wind in the air providing a cool breeze. Whatever it was, Gene could see himself living in a secluded place like Santa Fe when his fingers stopped working and he wanted to live a simple, quiet life. Would he think this when he woke up the next morning and there was nowhere to get a decent coffee? Only time and the strength of his morning hangover would tell. Like spotting a lighthouse from the middle of the Black Sea, Gene could now see the store. Video, spelled with 2 I's. It was at the end of a beaten-down street. To his right and left were vacant, boarded-up buildings. Redline Video seemed to be the only business on this side of the town that had a pulse. When he arrived just outside the store, he could see that the movies being displayed through the windows were not actual movies. They were just rows and rows of stickers, VHS-sized stickers with indecipherable movie titles. From close up, this store looked fake, like a background location on a movie set. Gene turned around. The whole street kind of felt like a movie set. It was relayed to him from his assistant, Sonia, that he was to knock 3 times on the front door. He did as instructed and then waited. The front door swung open, slowly. In front of him, on the floor, was a narrow red carpet about 50 feet long, leading towards a display case. It was a narrow walkway, narrow enough to reinforce the fact that Gene needed to change up his diet when he got back home. He began to walk down the aisle, noticing what was painted on the bright white walls. They were drawings, childlike drawings of families watching TV. Most of them were stick figures, but they were large, covering up both walls all the way to the ceiling. Gene reached the end of the red carpet and was now in front of a display case, an actual display case, with only one option. The title? Gene. He smiled. He had to appreciate the effort here, a plus for presentation. Gene actually spoke out loud, assuming there had to be a witness somewhere. This couldn't just be all for naught. I think I'll go with Gene. Gene picked up Gene. Gene's excitement was mixed with confusion. Did he just take the tape? How does he pay? Was there more to this endeavor? There had to be, he assumed. There was no door behind the display case. The only way in or out of Redline Video seemed to be the front entrance. He talked out loud again. I guess I'll be going now. Gene walked back down towards the entrance with his video in hand, slowly turning backwards every couple of feet, waiting for some kind of reaction. When he finally got outside, the lights shut off. Gene stood there, waiting for something, but nothing happened. He was disappointed. He'd expected some grand action, something intended to terrify. There was nothing, just simplicity. He walked, got the tape, walked out. As he started to walk away down the dark street, he began to appreciate it more and more. If this were a horror movie, the video store would have tried to create some kind of cliché horror movie moment. Some cheap jump scare, some convoluted plot device to force fear. Instead, it was all about the tape. The tape in his hand was the event. Nothing would take away from that. He couldn't wait to get back to the hotel and watch what he had come all this way for. Showtime.
Tonight's the night. Let's break the time. Been waiting all week. We won't slow down. Gonna light up the stage. I'll kick it. Go to the rhythm. Let's try to dance. Under the Broadway lights will shine. Taking our teens, making them divine. Let's go, let's pick, no holding back. Still I like it.
Gene placed the VHS tape labeled Gene into the hotel VCR and sat back into his somewhat comfortable but a little too narrow, if he's being honest, guest chair. The lights had been turned off. He poured himself half a gin and tonic. Let the show begin. Black. That's all there was on screen at first. Black. It lasted long enough that Gene got up, aimed his finger toward the fast-forward button, but stopped when he sensed a shift. He saw that there was now something on the screen. It was him. Kind of. It was a man who looked somewhat like Gene. The wig was obvious. He had similar thick, wide-framed glasses. The clothing was nearly spot on. The skin tone of the fake Gene was more tan, plastic. Real-life Gene had a couple more pounds, and his facial skin wasn't quite as smooth as the man pretending to be Gene. Fake Gene had a couple inches on real Gene, if only, real Gene thought, while gazing at the upgraded version of his own body. The set, as it were, which was Gene's office, was very well staged. The messy desk, the same brand of word processor, the framed newspaper articles and movie posters that Gene handpicked to keep him company late at night or early in the morning when the office felt like a ghost town. Gene loved that feeling of a ghost town. He was at his best when he was completely alone. Writing was an escape to create and control worlds. It provided immense comfort for him through his life. This was not comforting. This was scary. The following scene was of fake Gene and fake Jim Robards discussing his trip. The dialogue did not match. Gene was much more dismissive of the endeavor, qualifying it as a way for him to seem like a man of the people and then admitting openly that he was just looking to get a little side action from some dim southern floozy who didn't know who he was. Jim came off particularly brash, telling him that the real currency of this job was making people think we care. Real-life Gene was now sitting on the floor, against the edge of his bed, staring up. He was both mesmerized and alarmed, but he couldn't shut it off. The third scene was fake Gene and fake Sonia, who had a more gratuitously sexual clothing style and presence, sitting in Gene's office. She asked him if she could get a promotion. He asked what skills she had acquired that would make her worthy of this promotion. She began to unbutton her blouse. Gene fast-forwarded. For as much of a horndog and flirt that he was, he couldn't watch this. Sonia was the closest thing he had to a daughter, and this was many bridges too far. The sex scene was long, nearly 20 minutes by the VCR clock count. They explored each other's bodies all over and all across fake Gene's office. The next scene was Gene on a plane. It was just a close-up of him in his chair, no doubt a cost-cutting measure by whatever sick, twisted demon had filmed this satanic mockumentary. A very attractive flight attendant walks up to Gene and asks if he wants a drink. Rather than give him one, she leads him into the bathroom for entry into the Mile High Club. Of all the horrors that Gene speculated on in regards to what this Redline video experience would become, this was not one of them. Never in his most despicable nightmares had he thought that someone would do this. Him and his life? Who would possibly want to watch this? Better question, who would possibly want to film this? He was still fast-forwarding. He hadn't stopped once he saw Sonia unbutton her blouse. He had to know what other horrors awaited him and was too nervous and impatient to wait in real time. The structure of his trip was accurate, even if none of the details were. Being driven from the airport, checking into the hotel, as yet another very attractive, heavy-chested woman checked him in and then brought him into the coat room for what was deemed big client perks. Next was fake Gene sitting at an empty table towards the back of what was loosely being made to look like a steakhouse. Fake Gene would interact occasionally with either one very jacked waiter or, yes, you guessed it, another heavy-chested waitress. What kind of demented freak would make a parody of Gene's life that was actually pornographic? He couldn't stop asking that same question. Who would want to see Gene, or even fake, slightly taller Gene, having sex? It was so preposterous that real Gene actually started to laugh. How could this be real? Apparently, the lack of cinematic flair of every frame real Gene had seen up until this moment was being saved for the next section of the movie. It was the section focused on the Redline video store and what lay inside of it. Fake Gene emerged from the dark, ominous street leading up to Redline. It felt like a Western. This was slick, stylish, synth rock underscore kicking into gear when he goes into the video store that fueled the adrenaline. Fake Gene walked into the store, which looked exactly how Gene had seen it in real life, and then walked up to the display case. The bright, beautiful display case. Fake Gene grabbed the copy of Fake Gene's VHS tape and then walked out of the store. Real Gene could see that there was still an hour left on the tape. What would happen once he reached real time in his life? Would it go into the future? Real Gene was riveted with fear and anticipation. His heartbeat was making his whole body vibrate. The next scene was Fake Gene sitting in a dimly lit motel room, blinds closed, putting a VHS tape into the VCR, sitting on the edge of his bed and watching himself. But it wasn't quite Fake Gene in the video that Fake Gene was watching. It was a skinnier, more muscular Gene. His clothing was crisper. There was no wig. It was a slick, natural, faded haircut. The big glasses were thinner and more fashionable. The bodies of the women were even more sexual and provocative. They were barely wearing any clothing. The sex scenes were longer, much longer, more aggressive. Previously, the women seemed to be potentially enjoying it. Now, they seemed to be in pain. The sex was so aggressive, Real Gene couldn't even look. He would fast forward and occasionally look up to see when it was over. The depravity had reached new lows. Gene had lived through the 1970s. He had traveled through Europe. He had seen provocative films before, but to some extent they felt like films. This felt like pure smut. Developed and produced for only the most sinister audience members. The tape Fake Gene watched of Fake Gene was nearly an hour. There was minimal dialogue or character interaction. The whole film within a film was nothing more than a loosely strung together collection of pornographic scenes. Real Gene was watching Fake Gene watch Fake Gene. Real Gene was frozen. The film ends with Fake Gene watching Fake Gene unzipping his pants, and then Real Gene shut it off. He knew how it ended. Racing through his mind now was how to take legal action. These scumbags had desecrated his image, all for their publicity, and Real Gene would never give it to them. He was going to assemble the best team of lawyers that his paper could assemble and bury these bastards 6 feet under. This would never see the light of day. Neither would Redline Video. He would turn it into a boarded up, vacant bag of bricks, just like all the surrounding properties. Real Gene picked up the phone, boiling with rage, and began to dial Jim's number, and then he stopped. They would want to watch the tape. Maybe not Jim. Well, probably Jim. He would want to see, at least for a minute. But the lawyers would most certainly need to see it. They would need to see this barbaric, shameful attempt at revenge. Revenge for what? Gene assumed he must have given a bad review to someone connected to this film. It wouldn't be hard to find them, he thought. He worked with some of the best researchers in the world. They would track this dirtbag down and burn him to ash. Gene's hand was hovering above the landline, debating whether to hit the final digit of Jim's home phone. He tried to close his eyes just for a moment. Jim, you're not going to believe this. Gene sat back in his chair and told Jim about the movie starring Gene. Jim insisted that they track down this little shitheel and eviscerate him. But, Jim said, you gotta write about what you saw. Future of Fear. That was the title of Gene's article. It began with a hypothesis stating that horror movies will only become more depraved and popular as time goes on. Why? Gene went on to explain in great depth. He believed that as the world became safer and the concept of war became more outdated, it was fundamental human nature to seek out fear. It was in our blood. Going back to the days we had to leave our caves to find and kill animals for dinner to feed ourselves and our families. That primal lust within our bloodlines would never fade away. It was ingrained into us. Gene kept going. He wrote, quote, "As with any genre, you must adapt or die. Just like the animals we hunt, the genre will have to continuously top themselves, but the horror audience does not care as much about character or plot. They care about the feeling of fear. They will not feel this in life. There will be no great war. There will be no riots in the streets. Technology has increasingly encouraged us to stay home. Would there be a day when movie theaters were no longer the best place to watch movies?" Gene guessed that the answer was unquestionably yes. "Our TVs will only get bigger. Our sound systems will only get louder. The theater experience will become increasingly irrelevant." Gene detailed a moment he saw firsthand a couple months ago when a cell phone began to ring inside a movie theater that was playing a film he despised entitled From Dusk Till Dawn. Gene said that the people who loved From Dusk Till Dawn more than anyone were the people who made the movie. He was only sorry that he couldn't sell them his ticket. Quentin Tarantino talked about this review on The Tonight Show, staring into the camera and telling Gene Morgan to go screw himself. The moment in question regarding the cell phone was detailed by Gene, who wrote, quote, "This wealthy man stood up and took the call as he walked out of the theater, as everyone within spitting distance watched in pure disdain. What if he was a dark beacon of what is to come? What if cell phones became accessible for everyone? What if the entire audience had tiny little computers in their pockets that could disrupt and derail the blissful viewing experience for everyone who'd paid to watch a movie together in a dark room? Wouldn't people prefer to stay at home in their own designed comfort?" This was the longest article that Gene had ever written. It would also sadly be his last. He passed away 3 weeks after it came out. He died peacefully in his home while watching a movie. The movie was Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It came out in 1956. Gene referenced it more than any other movie. He dubbed it the scariest film he has ever and will ever see, because the villains within the film are people that the protagonist loves. They are his friends, family, lovers. Imagine a world in which anyone you saw could be the monster. It was with a bittersweet irony that this was the last film Gene ever watched. The final section of Gene's article was the one that scared all of his readers. He wrote, quote, "The future of entertainment will be curated by you. In the same way we can now record our own personal message on our answering machines, so too will the advancement in entertainment not only allow, but also encourage whatever our desires wish for, no matter how devilish they may be. As with the science fiction books of my youth that became the science fiction movies of my adulthood, the inevitable convergence of man and artificial intelligence feels closer than we might think. The dystopian tales of my childhood seemed unreachable. Now, they feel around the corner. What if you could direct all your entertainment, movies, music, television? What if the future is a world in which anything you want to see can be viewed simply with a couple of clicks on your own personal computer? I don't know about you, dear readers. I, for one, am terrified."
It's a cool night, the moon's alight, your touch is gentle, feels so right. It's not her touch, but a soft touch. It's all right with me. Whispered words under the stars, lost in where we are. This might be wrong, but it feels so strong. It's all right with me. It's a smooth groove. With you I move. Your laugh is soothing in this mood. It's not her laugh, but it's a sweet laugh. frighten me.